All right, welcome to House of Halls podcast. Liz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Of course. Today we are going to discuss emotions coexisting, which would be grief, because that's, what we talk about here, and then really any other emotion.
Mhm.
Um, where where my brain goes with this is after a loss, everyone processes it differently, right? Like we all process loss differently. We all deal with it differently. Some of us acknowledge it, some of us don't. Some people are very outspoken about it, some people are not. And I just think because of that, it's very hard as like a third party, right? A friend, a family member, anyone from the outside looking in
Mhm.
to understand, maybe is the word. Um, and be able to process what you're processing.
Mhm.
Um, so kind of talk in another episode about relationships and like losing a loved one and when it's, society deems it's acceptable to find somebody else.
Sure.
And I think that's a good example of like things coexisting because from the outside or maybe somebody who hasn't lost somebody or at least somebody that in that kind of relationship, they can't wrap their head around how you could grieve a loss and find someone else, and they look at it as like a replacement.
Mhm.
Or the example of somebody maybe losing a kid
Mhm.
and losing a child and then having another child at some point after they lose one.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of people have a lot of opinions on it, but I think it's just because they're not in those shoes, they can't process it. Or if they
Right.
have been in those shoes, they process it so differently, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think there's just something to be said about helping people understand that grief is not your identity when you lose
Yes.
somebody. Like it does not become you, it does not define you. I can be sad and sit in a room and genuinely laugh and also feel joy at the same time.
Mm.
And I know that sounds really kind of like loony bin crazy, but I think a good example and as we're in the middle of the holidays and we have all this family time, like for me, William is a perfect example of that. So at every family gathering, of course, my little brother would be here. And if you are listening for the first time or have only listened to one or two episodes, part of my story is that in 2020, I lost my little brother to suicide. He was 17 at the time. And so, of course, family gets together. And I always feel that grief ever since that day. If my whole family is together, I feel a constant pain and grief when we are together and he is not there.
Sure.
However, it doesn't mean that the entire time I'm with my family, I'm just like sad or mopey or depressed or that it upsets me. I still feel like we make so many happy memories. Like it
Mhm.
is still such a joyful thing for me. I look forward to it. I laugh so much. I am genuinely happy in those moments, even though I do feel grief. And I won't say that it's all, rainbows and butterflies. Like there are moments that I just kind of look around and like think of him and I get genuinely sad. Like
Right.
I feel like maybe I'm around my period because I've been emotional this week. However, but I will, and I'll just kind of sit there and be like, "Oh,
Mm.
okay," but like we're all happy right now. This is a weird time to cry, and I might step out of the room or something, like
Yeah.
get myself together. But it doesn't mean that that isn't that moment for me. Does
Right.
that make sense?
It does. Well, and I think what you're describing is grief doesn't change you, but it transforms you. And so you have a capacity of appreciating things that's different. The sadness and loss, but also the joy of being with people. And you've discussed that. Like your appreciation for little things is so different living in the wake of loss.
Yeah,
And I think one of the things that you articulate well is getting back to living. And so there's no timeline on grief and it's not linear. However, our job is to figure out how to keep living despite pain, despite loss. And that's going to look different for each person. But if we stay in isolation and if we stay in sadness, anger, or grief, it's not going to be productive.
yeah. Productive is such a good word.
Yeah. And so I think that's where we've talked about how grief forces vulnerability on us, and that's very uncomfortable. And some people lean into that and embrace it and grow, and other people resist it and feel what they feel, you know,
Yeah.
and I see that clinically is there are some individuals who throughout their life, they do not feel. They choose not to feel. They would rather stay in their thinking brain and or in their to-do lists or in their day to day. And so this forced vulnerability is very uncomfortable for them.
Like using distraction as a coping mechanism, like in that sense?
Mhm. Yeah, like a defense mechanism and or a coping mechanism. And then something might happen where it's not working anymore. And so we have to introduce this concept of what if we started to feel a little bit in a safe place, like in therapy or with a safe person, where you could just start to reflect on how you feel. And that
Mm,
can be very scary if you've never done it in your day to day life when you have a very real loss that comes with a lot of conflicting emotions.
mm, okay.
So I'm just sharing that from the clinical perspective that grief is not clinical. Grief is part of human life and experience. We all have elements of loss that we can draw from, where we
Yeah.
could think, yeah, I've lost, you know, maybe a loved one, maybe a pet, maybe a job, maybe a relationship. So there's different categories of grief and loss.
Yeah.
And I think when we get closer to the ones that are incredibly traumatic or painful, if we haven't practiced feeling and thinking about grief and loss in smaller ways, and then you have one that's like not optional, this is traumatic, that is where I'm saying individuals can become numb or
Mm. And
they can
seems
stop
like
functioning.
insensitive to it.
Yes, yes, and seem insensitive, and it can feel even scarier to
Mm,
go to that vulnerable place.
okay. So you're saying like it's almost like they don't know how to process it.
They
So
don't know
they
because
just
they haven't
almost
practiced.
like pretend it didn't happen. At
Correct,
least to the outside looking in. Or
correct.
like is it truly like just that their processing is not processing?
That can happen.
It's like a denial, like a
That can happen. Numbness can also happen.
yeah.
Reaction formation can happen where you choose to do other things instead of deal with your grief. There's some really beautiful images on social media where it talks about giving attention to your thoughts and feelings, or your body will force you to. Um, and so I think that's the other piece where we can't ignore the mind body connection. So when we go through emotional experiences, these are not just made up things. It's very real. There's a neurobiological response that happens. And so it's important to be mindful when we think, "Oh, I'm so exhausted, I don't know why." Well, are you internally managing a lot of thoughts and feelings that you're not giving attention to and it's costing you energy?
Mm,
Or um, you know, there's a lot of data on our stress response and how that can impact our cortisol levels and what's called our HPA axis. And that's kind of what drives our stress response. Our body can only be in fight or flight or rest and digest. And so those are kind of terms for how your nervous system is feeling. So if you're
yeah.
kind of at a low level, stressed all the time, that impacts you.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I'm going with this is we have to tune into that. Or eventually our body is going to signal us, you're not okay. And we're not always going to connect the dots. Like, oh, I've been low level stressed since that happened to me and I experienced loss,
And
6
it
years
shows
ago,
up in, of
1 year
course,
ago.
weight gain,
Mhm,
all these other ways, and you don't realize it's all a symptom of
mhm,
something you've been suppressing that your brain is
mhm.
it happened and, like, your brain needs to process it, right? Like,
Yeah,
realize
100%. And I think this topic of holding 2 emotions or multiple emotions that can be true at the same time, that is a foreign concept to many people, and it's very scary to think, "I'm gonna choose to think about something," vulnerable, and I don't know where it's gonna go, right? If I start talking about how I feel
Mhm.
about the loss of my brother to suicide, I don't know, like, where's the end? Is someone gonna catch me? Are my emotions gonna stop? Am I gonna be able to function? Am I gonna be able to parent? Right? Like, I think that is a very protective element of the human experience where we're like, so I'm just not gonna do it because I don't know where it ends or where it goes.
Yeah.
Versus I'm gonna carve out a little bit of time to think about how I'm doing today about that loss. And then I'm gonna get back to doing some other things I need to do. So it's not all or nothing.
Mhm.
And the more that we practice that, the more we're able to feel what you're describing. Like, I can be with my family and be silly and have immense joy and have tears welling up, and I have to take a break because I wish William was here, or whatever the language is for you. I'm saying that. But um, I mean, I had an experience the other day. I'm currently pregnant, and my aunt was at my house helping me just put some things away. And
Mhm.
this is going to sound how it sounds. And anyone who has been in my pantry, this is so weird. So
Let's
just
hear it.
think, here it comes. So I lost my grandmother um, January of 2020. And when
Photo.
we were cleaning up her house, this is my nana
Okay.
up in Georgia. And we were cleaning up her house, and she had this weird obsession with Dr. Pepper, and she had one, like, Dr. Pepper left, not in a can, in, like, a plastic container, and I took it, and it's still in my pantry, and I understand that is weird, and it is
No, it's as somebody
silly.
to me, it's not, to the rest of the world, maybe.
Yeah, and so my aunt's at my house, like, helping me with a few things before this baby comes, and she's like, "You don't drink Dr. Pepper?" And I was like, like, instantly, like, I almost couldn't talk, and I was like, "It's because
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, there are these little nuances where there's meaning, and it makes me emotional because I'm thinking, I wish she was here in this
Yeah.
season, but it's okay that she's not. Like, I can still celebrate, like,
Mhm.
the experiences that we had. And so I think the more that we practice those things and the more that we talk about them, the more we realize, like, man, this human experience is kind of crazy,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
I wanna go back to one thing you said, and that thing is that you don't drink Dr. Pepper, and
Yeah.
I actually, in the years I've known you, have an underlying issue with our friendship in this moment.
Okay. Let's talk about it.
The only soda I will, other than a Sprite if I'm a little hungover and not feeling well, I will consume is a Diet Dr. Pepper because it is the most
I have one for
life-changing.
you from 2020 and it's in my pantry.
I could never consume your grandma like that. But like I think we need to maybe revisit once you have this
Yeah.
baby.
Yeah.
I think you need to keep a more open mind.
Thank you. Okay, I'll consider this.
Revisit your taste buds.
Yeah.
I was
It's not that I discriminate against the Dr. Peppers of the world. I don't know what it is.
like I feel like your reaction was very like that's not mine. Like it was partially defensive,
It
like
was a little defensive. Yeah.
no, I love that. I had a similar okay, so this is also kind of creepy, but I have some of William's ashes. So we did spread them. I can't say where because I found out I don't know if it was like the most legal thing that we did. I
It
didn't
was
know when we did it, but
an approved way.
we spread them somewhere a little bit. But I kept some because I've always wanted Chris and I have a goal of owning a mountain house up in North Carolina, and like one day that will be like we'll be able to leave Florida, and like that's where we will live when we don't have kids and whatever. But we also want it to be a cabin, like our family can go visit, do these things while they're growing up. And I intentionally said I want to keep some of these because once we buy this land or house or whatever it is, I
Yeah.
want his ashes. I want him to always be there.
Yeah.
So I've kept them, and they're in like it's not like in an urn or anything. Like they're they're in like the baggie that
That's okay.
they're in the baggie that they came in, but they're in this like somebody gave me some piece of jewelry after he died, and that came in this little box. Okay, so I had this little box. I was like, oh, this this bag fits in the box,
This is
and
William's box.
this is yeah, and one of the wristbands from his funeral I have like wrapped around it because it also fits. So it like
Yeah.
closes it, right?
It's perfect.
It is until you put it somewhere that your children can reach it. Okay. So I'm, very caught off guard one day as I walk into my room, and it was like in one of my nightstands, which is on the ground. And I think like two of them, or it had to have been Kenzie and Ellie, because this was like 2 houses ago. But they they pulled it out and she's like, "Oh, I want," like, she wanted the bracelet off it, and then they're opening it and they're like, "What's oh, rocks." And I'm like, "Oh my god." Like, "Oh my god." I'm like, "Put it back." And they're like, "Well, why do
Yeah,
you have," like,
yeah,
they're so curious.
yeah,
And
there's
just went into this like freak out mode
yeah,
of like, "How do I tell you that's your uncle?" I
yeah,
don't, I don't, I did not. I was like, "What?" "Well, why do you need that?" I said, "Don't touch it. Don't touch it." I'm like freak. I'm like, "Oh my god, you can't touch this. This is like the most sacred thing in this house. Like, if this house
oh,
burns down, it's what I'm taking with me. Like,
right, that's why
do
it's in
not
my nightstand, so I
touch
can
my
grab it on my way out.
bracelet." Yeah. And mind you, this box is like light tan, like pink and teal, like very little
Looks
girl would
fun.
be like, yeah. And I'm just like, maybe this is not the place to keep my brother's ashes. Like,
So I
maybe.
think, for anyone listening, if you have ashes that are not in an urn or out of reach of children,
I was
can
just
I
thinking
just
of
say
all the, like, what if I didn't see them and they're like, "Oh, it's dirt. I'm taking it outside." And like, I just
right? That you did. And then I'm also thinking of all people, your brother is probably like, "That's hilarious."
absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like he like jumped out of the box and was like, "Play with me. Freak mom out. Freak her
Yeah,
out."
yeah, "Hey, let's go put this somewhere."
Oh my god. I would die. I would die. Okay, I'm sorry. Back to our focus of the coexisting emotions.
You can be shocked and
You can be mortified and sad and kind of find humor in it all at
all
once.
at the same time.
All at once.
Yeah.
Um, but yet I wanted to go back to kind of what you were saying about like forcing yourself to acknowledge
Mm,
those emotions. And
mhm,
we have an episode that was published a while ago called The Power of Therapy,
right,
where we talked about the power of therapy. Spoiler alert, that's what it's about. But you put it in such a good way. Now, in that episode, I'm not going to rehash it, but I talk about like kind of the reason I started therapy. But the way you put it was like, it gives us a place to, like, if some hard feelings come up and it's almost like not the time, right? Where you were just talking about, like, we're like, okay, well, where does this end? Where is this going to go? How do I
right.
stop? Like, how do I get back into this moment if I go down this hole or go down this
Mhm,
path, right? I want to call it a hole. Um, that was so well worded for me. So basically, what it was is, like, if you start thinking these thoughts or you need to process that, but it's just not the time, you
mhm,
can, like, for me, I'll write things like in my notes so that
right,
the next time I have therapy, like, that's where I open that. I
yeah,
open that box and we have that discussion and it's a place that I can leave it. But it was almost, I always thought of it that way, but I never thought of it in the way that you had posed it was, if this isn't the time, it gives you a time to sit there and focus on that, that you can put it away. And it almost gives you this outlet and this avenue to know like it will be addressed. I just
yeah,
can't address it right now.
yeah,
And I think that is such a helpful thought and process of, especially when you're feeling those conflicting emotions,
mhm,
or it's just not the time or place, or you know what, sometimes I am just like too tired, right?
mhm,
Like, gosh, I really need to hash this out in my brain and say it out loud, but, like, I also just want to, like, mindlessly watch this Hallmark movie and go to bed, and it's like, you don't have to do it right then. You can
mhm,
sometimes I spill the thoughts, sometimes I just put the topic, or sometimes I'm
mhm,
like, "You know
mhm.
what? We'll talk about this in therapy," and I put it in the back of my brain, and if it comes back, it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. So I think that is such a good that is why therapy is such a good tool because of these emotions that will coexist in us,
Yeah,
and this weird, I think, even somebody trying to process the thought of feeling like, I think if I were to tell some random person like, "Hey, you can feel joy and grief simultaneously," they'd be like, "You're wrong. You're wrong." And I'm not, because I felt it.
no, you're not. Well, and I think that's the beauty also of friendships where you can be transparent, like, "Oof, I felt these things all at the same time."
Mhm.
And the more that we're in relationships that we can be honest about those things, the more normalized it becomes. Because yes, there's absolutely stuff that should be given time and attention in a way that is probably therapy. But
Yeah.
therapy is something you graduate from, and then you have the skills that you take with you into your life.
Mhm.
And, we talked about that in that episode as well. And so I'm thinking for anyone who's listening and they're like, I take pride in not feeling my feelings or I'm doing fine. Because a lot of times that's what I hear in the therapy room is I didn't know that this was eventually gonna stop working. Like it's worked for me, quote,
Yep,
if we're listening and not watching our YouTube, quote, quote, quote,
you're air
"This is
quoting.
working." No, it really wasn't. It was allowing you to function. Sure, it served a purpose, and it served a purpose in your life,
Yep,
and there's no judgment or blame there because these are normal. We all have defense mechanisms.
yep,
And depending on what we were modeled in the adults in our life, we might not have grown up in environments where people asked us, "How are you feeling about that?" So we need
yeah,
to be patient with ourselves as adults and compassionate when we bump into things that are new or uncomfortable.
yeah. And I wanna say one last thing on this topic. I don't know if you probably don't get the alerts, but there was a comment left on one of our on our podcast on YouTube where somebody was like, I guess we had referred to like having kind of like that circle of friends that you can be vulnerable with or whatever.
Mm,
And they said, "Well, what if you like, how do I find those people? How do I find those
mhm.
7 people?" And I don't know why they said 7. I don't think we referred to it, but that's okay. How do we find those people essentially?
Yes.
And I think that is another how you were just talking about like somebody you can be vulnerable with. I will say
Yes.
it is hard. I'm not going to say it's an easy thing to find. However, I think there might already be for anyone listening that feels that way like, okay, so how do I find that person or those people? There might already be someone in your life that is that person, but you don't know it because we attract what we are and we mimic the way we somebody else acts or makes us feel, right? Like there's a lot of people that are very vulnerable with me and people I would say that I'm not even close with that are very vulnerable with me. And it's because I'm vulnerable. It is because I'm very granted on a much bigger scale than like I'm saying somebody else needs to be, but like
Yeah, that's not the
I
expectation.
yes, I think you find those friends by looking at the friends you already have and being showing them that you're willing to be vulnerable, and then you're gonna see which ones are willing to be vulnerable back or willing to receive that.
Yeah,
And I don't think it means you go out and wear a sign around your neck that says, "I'm looking for friends to be vulnerable with." You know, I think it truly starts with like, there's times you just might have to be that person first. And I get that that's very scary,
yeah,
but I do think that's kind of again, you're gonna attract what you are. And if that's the kind of person you want in your life, you also have to be that person.
yes.
Um, so I wanted to say that. I hope that's helpful for somebody. Um, I
I
hope
think it's well said. I think what you're saying, like, lead with vulnerability,
yeah,
lead with love, and it will be reciprocated.
yeah,
Maybe not with everyone, but as you start to see that reciprocation, then you know, "Oh, okay, you are a person I could do this with."
yeah. It's in a weird way, it's defined a lot of my friendships. I know who to go
Mhm.
to for what. I know who's gonna come to me for what. I know if I'm feeling a certain way, kind of like depending on what I want to feel back, who I'm gonna tell that to, you know? And it's kind of like, who do I want honesty? Do I want compassion? Do I want a little bit of both? You know, like
I want some humor.
yeah, exactly. Who has some dark trauma that they can laugh at this with me too? So okay, awesome. Well, if you are listening for the first time, I don't know where you're finding us, but we are on YouTube, Spotify, hopefully Apple Music. Thank you so much for being here. We're also on Instagram at House of Halls Community, and
Yeah,
we'd love for you to join us on one or all of those platforms. So we will talk to you
absolutely.
next time.